I'd like to say, I guess it's late afternoon, early evening. Thank you all for coming today. Today I just wanted to share a little bit about the situation, the incident that occurred in the early morning hours of just past Saturday on June the 15th. I wanted to make sure that we were open and showed as much transparency as we can. But please remember, as we talk about this incident, that we're only about 2.5 days. So there's still a lot of work to be done. Follow-up interviews and recanvassing, going through forensics evidence that we've recovered, and just continuing to process what we have at this point. But I did want to share with the community. I think that's important as much as we can. But just remember that we are just 2.5 days into this shooting situation, and there's still a case that has to be put together, handed over to the Commonwealth Attorney to make the final determinations. We will handle this just like we would anything else. Okay? All right. So and look, before I get into the incidents, the facts that we know, I just want to be any loss of life is tragic, regardless of the circumstances. And we still have to respond and address those issues that officers are confronted with or our communities confronted with. But any loss of life is tragic, and it matters to me, and it matters to this community and this department. And I'll share a little bit as we go through some of the conversations that I've had in our city and with family members. Okay. In the early morning hours of this past Saturday, June 15th, police officers were involved in a police shooting. What had happened? Where I'm going to start. I'm going to try to give a little bit of backstory, and then I'm going to take you to where we can first timestamp something for sure about a traffic accident that happens in our city, and then we'll go for there. But I want you to have a little bit of the backstory. So in the early morning hours of Saturday, June the 15th, Miss Monet Bonaparte, she is a 38-year-old female. She called a friend and asked for assistance in getting a ride from Portsmouth over to this side of the water. And we're not really sure if she was trying to get to Hampton or Newport News. We're trying to figure that out as we go through. But she did ask. She was in Portsmouth and asked for a ride over to the peninsula. The individual she talked to arranged for another individual to go to Portsmouth, pick her up, and bring her back over to this side. In doing so, that individual that was going to give her a ride stopped and picked up a friend and met Miss Bonaparte in Portsmouth, and then they began to drive across the water. They came through the tunnel there and come into our city, and at some point something happens inside of that vehicle. There's some kind of conversation or movement. Something happens inside that vehicle that agitates Mrs. Bonaparte. What we have, according to individuals in the vehicle, that Ms. Bonaparte displays a firearm. She begins talking at a fast pace, kind of erratic. She becomes very agitated, and at some point she takes that firearm and orders the passenger out of the vehicle. So the car stops. At gunpoint, the passenger is ordered out of the vehicle, and then she instructs the driver to continue. Now, in that process, she is in the passenger seat behind the individual driving. What we know, or what we've been told at this point, is that the driver is instructed at gunpoint on where to go to make turns, left here, right here, go to this direction. He's pistol whipped or struck with a firearm a couple times as Miss Bonaparte continues to direct him where to go. At some point, she begins to continue to get agitated and grabs the wheel and pulls on the wheel. That causes the vehicle to veer, and that is where we have the first time frame, and you may have saw some of the responses from the community, some ring camera footage of a vehicle that hits some parked cars, bounces off a couple of parked cars, and at that point, at 2:17 in the morning, that's the crash on 16th Street, Miss Bonaparte exits the vehicle. We also were able to pick bits and pieces of that up, not only from ring camera footage that we've seen in the media, but also from some of the department cameras that we have in the area, caught the tail end of that accident and has a timestamp on there. So at that point, the driver of the vehicle, he pulls off and goes into Hampton, where he himself calls the police department, the Hampton Police Department. Without going too much into conversation he has, he does call 911. We're able to hear that 911 tape just earlier this morning. And that was one of the reasons it took us a while, is we were trying to collect all this information and put out as much as we can. So he does call 911. It's Hampton Dispatch, and you can hear the frantic concern. I don't want to say fearful, but he's certainly very, very concerned and explains what happened. He uses the word carjacked. That's why I tried to explain a little bit about what happened in that vehicle with the firearm being pointed at him. He was struck in the head, the side of the face with that firearm. And he talks about what has just occurred. Hampton Police then come to him and have some interaction with him. So that's going on at the same time Mrs. Bonaparte has exited the vehicle and is in our city. And she's in the area of Stewart Gardens. So what we have at that point is we begin to get 911 calls. Now we received, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the number and the times, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about what those 911 calls contain. We had 6 911 calls before the police ever arrived to the scene from multiple individuals. We had 2 911 calls after the police arrived there. There was actually 1 911 call from Miss Bonaparte, and then there was 1 911 call. It's 911 dispatch trying to reach Miss Bonaparte's mother, and she does make contact and they have a conversation. So a couple of those 911 calls, just touching base collectively. Calls about a female that was armed with a firearm. There were calls about windows being broken out. There were calls about gunshots in the area. Some of that was picked up by our gunshot detection technology that we have. It gives an officer an idea of where those shots are coming from. The calls described as being agitated. You could hear, as officers arrive, they begin to hear conversations of agitation and talking at a fast rate. We'll talk a little bit more about that when we talk about Miss Bonaparte's actually 911 call that she made herself. While officers were there, as we said before, there were gunshots that were fired or discharged, and then while the officers arrived, they heard another gunshot themselves. Officers talked about that they heard a gunshot, and I believe they talked to one individual, and that, please take cover, that there's an individual shooting, please take cover until we figure out what we have. So at that point, Stewart Gardens it's kind of rows of apartments, and there's a big courtyard, if you will. So and there's no really barricades or place to take cover in that. So the officers had pulled back considerably to allow some distance, which is good for us for safety. And they begin to now have some conversation or attempt to have some conversation with Ms. Bonaparte. For about 10 to 12 minutes, they try to de-escalate. Please calm down, please talk to us, put the firearm down. In that area, there are some bushes and some shrubbery, so it is difficult to see, and with someone with a firearm that has already fired rounds, windows broken, and then hearing the gunshot themselves, the officers did take up a protective stance, if you will, behind a police shield. So that also restricts us somewhat of things that we can see as we're looking through that shield for our protection. So those conversations continue to go on. During that conversation, that is when Miss Bonaparte herself actually calls 911 and has a conversation with dispatch. I listened to that conversation this morning. In that conversation, she is talking at an accelerated pace, seems shortness of breath. She seems very, very agitated. At times, it's hard to understand what she's saying. You can hear officers as they're there while this conversation is going on. Dispatch is trying to relay to officers what they have. You can hear officers instructing her to put the gun down. No one wants to hurt you. Calm down. Put the gun down. Put the gun down. So Ms. Bonaparte continues to have conversations with dispatch. She asks us to reach out to her mother. She doesn't want to be transferred off of that call. And she says some things that are very concerning. She makes threats to what will happen if officers approach her. And then she does make some threats about hurting herself. So without going too much into that, it was threats enough of what would happen if officers approach her, what she would do, what action she would take that would harm officers, and then again about hurting herself. That was relayed to officers, and I believe one officer heard such comments about what would happen if the police approached her. So as we continue to have these conversations and instruct, one of the officers was able to kind of break away from that line and move over to, I would guess it would be the officer's left, which created an angle, a better view, a better direct line of sight to Miss Bonaparte. And in fact, that officer is one that was telling the others, she's put the gun down, she's picked it back up. She's put the gun down, she's picked it back up. And you hear the officers again continuing to talk. At that point, Miss Bonaparte, according to the officer, points her firearm in his direction, and then he fired. After that occurred, the officers gathered. They could still see some movement. They began a slow approach to Miss Bonaparte. When they got to her, there was a firearm laying beside her. That firearm, I should have said earlier, matched the description, at least a handgun, a black handgun that was described by the individual in the vehicle, as well as what the officers saw as they were talking communications and sharing information with the other officers. The officers immediately, once they got to her, immediately began to provide medical aid. Medics were called in. Miss Bonaparte was transported to a area hospital, where regrettably, she succumbed to her injuries. And that takes me back to how we started, that any loss of life is tragic, regardless of the circumstances that we respond to. Even a natural death, those are hard, and this situation is not unlike that, and I would even submit it's one of the harder things that officers have to respond to, they have to deal with. And to hear some of the panic in the voices of the individuals who called 911 and told us that I have kids here and there's someone breaking my glass. I don't know if someone has just shot through a window. Please send officers. We're scared. Please send officers right away. There's a female with a firearm. There's an individual with a firearm. We're hearing shots. You know, all those things as officers are driving to the scene, those are all being dispatched. And then to get there and hear another gunshot, and then to set up at a safe distance, or as safe as they can, and still have conversations with Miss Bonaparte or with this individual. There's a lot going on. The safety of the officers, the safety of the residents, and trying to de-escalate, and the safety of Miss Bonaparte in the state that she's in. So at that point, like I said, she was transported to the hospital, and later she succumbed to the injuries. Officers went to the hospital. Officers then were transported here to headquarters where the investigation begins to take place. Canvases have been completed, at least 2 that I know of. Forensics processed the scene there and collected evidence. And we would handle this situation just like we would any shooting in our city. The findings will be put together from our forensics division, our homicide division. They'll be collected and submitted to our Commonwealth Attorney, Mr. Gwynn, and he and his team will then render a final decision about the actions and the circumstances that took place here. We stayed here till about noon on Saturday morning. We had to send some detectives home to get some sleep and came back, and they've been working through the weekend, and we started again early this morning. It's about 8 o'clock. I could not be more impressed for the officers and their response, meaning that they went into harm's way not knowing exactly what they had. We were able to do some interviews with the individuals that were in the vehicle where we went back and started, so it's a little, piecing that together. I want to thank the Hampton Police Department for, we were able to determine pretty quickly that what they had in their city tied to what we had was the same incident, the same individuals. But there's still a lot of work to do. We're far from being finished. I want to be careful again that I don't jeopardize anything that's going forward in the case and the investigation. There's some interviews that still have to be completed. Officers were able to talk to some family members at the scene and at the hospital. And before I left Saturday morning, I talked to Miss Bonaparte's mom. And I was I didn't call her to talk about the specifics of the case. I called her to let her know that I know she just lost her daughter. And regardless of what happened, I wanted her to know that I was just calling to have a conversation, that they got a call from, not that I'm anybody important, that they just got a call from the department to have a conversation with her. I wanted to check on her and her family, and we had a good conversation. You can only imagine, I wish it was a conversation I never had to make, but you can only imagine, what someone might feel. And then I reached out again, and we had another conversation today. I believe I owed it to her and her family to let them know we would be doing a little bit of a press conference today to talk a little bit about what happened, trying to piece some things together. I told her that we still had a lot of things to go through, but I appreciate that she took my call. She didn't have to do that, and we just had a short conversation this morning. I hope that mattered to her. It certainly did to me. But I appreciate the work that the detectives have done and are doing. Again, from the detectives, forensics, the officers in South Precinct that responded to a situation that anytime that you have gunfire and just not sure what you're walking into, I was impressed and proud of the way they responded. So I'll take a few questions, but I'm not going to go too far into too many details. And again, just remember, I know I've said it a couple times, we're only about 2.5 days. But I wanted to be able to talk to you a little bit and share a little bit with our citizens of what we have at this point. So I'll try to take a few questions, but I just be mindful. We still have a case to investigate, and we're only a couple days into this. Is there anybody have any questions? Yes, ma'am.
How many shots approximately did Ms. Bonaparte fire in Stewart Gardens? And when you got that call, when you prepared for an active shooter?
So I think when you the shot spotter alerted to the number of shots fired, we had several calls of shots fired and the casings we recovered. I'm not going to go too much into that because we still have some individuals we want to interview, but it was numerous, let's say several. And then when officers so I've got citizens calling in, talking about there's someone firing here, there's someone with a gun, we're hearing gunshots. And what happened is some windows got broken out, and the family member thought someone had fired through the window. When officers got to the scene, they heard an additional round, so they did believe that there was could have an active shooter situation. And I don't recall what officer actually talked to the individual. At least one scenario that we know of where he get cover, we do have that's exactly what I would have said, unknowing when I come around that corner, what I'm going to face in that courtyard. So I believe those comments that officer made to that individual was to get down and get cover until we know exactly what we had. That's a fair question.
What was the woman and the passengers of that vehicle? What were they arguing about?
So that's one of the things that we're trying to clear up. We're not sure exactly what happened in that vehicle. If something was said, if there was an action or a movement, trying to understand a little bit what was going on in Ms. Bonaparte's state of mind, what she was feeling. But the conversation, what we have uncovered at this point is that she was very, very agitated. She produced a firearm, was speaking very, very erratically, and ordered one individual at gunpoint out of the vehicle, and then took control of the driver at gunpoint, and even struck him with the firearm. And when she separates from the vehicle after the accident, he drives to Hampton. That's pretty much the same account that he gave to 911 dispatch, and you can hear in his voice, right? You can hear him breathing heavy and trying to get out and explain what had occurred, but what he had actually went through. But what actually set that off, I don't have a good understanding yet. That's some of the follow-up questions and interviews that we need to get clarified to, but that's a great question. We do know that the firearm that was in Ms. Bonaparte's possession is a handgun. It was stolen out of Portsmouth in a burglary. I want to make sure I get this right. 2023. In 2023, it was stolen in a burglary out of a home in Portsmouth. So they'll still continue to get some of that information when go through that report. I'd like to read what that report. I'm not saying Ms. Bonaparte broke into any home. I'm not saying that at all. We just know that's where the gun is reported back to, and it comes up in a stolen report.
Were they all friends? Were they related?
So again, inside that vehicle, that's what we're trying were they friends, associates? Did they know each other? What we do know is Ms. Bonaparte reached out to an individual that she did know and asked for a ride from Portsmouth over. And then that individual arranged for someone to pick her up. That individual who went to pick her up picked up a friend, and they were driver, passenger, and Ms. Bonaparte was in the back seat.
And going back to something you said about when the officer sort of drove away, was kind of get that better vantage point. You said that the officer said he saw her point the gun at him and then fired the shot. Is that something that's seen in the body camera video, or is that something you guys are still kind of?
So, yeah, so that's a great question, and it's fair. Yeah, so it was hard when you know, the body-worn cameras are in our chest, center of the chest. When you have that shield up now, so we've got some obstruction there. When the officer moved to, peeled off to the left, it created an angle, much like a triangle effect, and he had a much better angle, much better view. There is some distance in that, the body-worn camera in that courtyard, but that's when that, he states that the firearm was pointed at him and that he fired. So they're going through, there's a, you know, we want to look at the body-worn camera of every officer there. We want to review that, and we'll make sure that all of that is sent over to the Commonwealth Attorney's Office, but there's still some things that we want to process and go through. That's a great question.
And just following up, I mean, well, not following up, but do you think enough was done in that moment to de-escalate the situation before it got to that point?
When you say, do I think enough was done, what do you mean?
Just, I guess, I mean, you kind of said it with, you know, you applaud the way your officers responded.
Right.
In that moment, do you think enough was done in that moment to de-escalate?
You know, we train our officers on de-escalation, and some of that, the results of that, what happens or what they're forced is actions by others. You know, I wish that there was a magic word or phrase that, hey, I'll just put this firearm down and we'll have a conversation. But we can't control. You know, we spend a lot of time talking about training and de-escalation. When I listen to her own 911 tape, when I hear the back and forth from the officers trying to explain to her, but really the clearest is when she calls 911 herself, and I can hear in her voice just the rapid speech, and it's kind of hard to understand and track. I think the officers did the best they could, but when you have an individual that has already fired rounds off, that officers hear a round fired, and their actions force us into a situation. You got to remember, those officers didn't know what they were walking into, and they've certainly got the calls that they've heard. They hear the rounds when they get there, and now they're having a conversation. And it would be my hope that Miss Bonaparte would have put that firearm down. It would have been my hope that she would have just, hey, let's get her some help, and she gives herself up to the officers. But that's just not what happened. And I wish we had a different outcome. I wish that she would have never, you know, maybe got out of that car and dialed 911 right away and let us get her some help. But there's actions that others do that force us to defend ourselves and others. And I wish we could have talked on and on, but her actions play a role in that. It's not just what the officer's actions are and the type of de-escalation. Her actions play a role in that, how it plays out. It has to be both parties. And regrettably, she chose, and you know, look, I'm not placing any blame, because I don't know what was going on in her heart or her mind. I don't know what she was going through. I wish we wouldn't have had a firearm injected into that situation. That's when that chemistry, you know, we see it all too often across our country. Firearms in situations of states of agitation, anger, frustration, what the outcome can be. That's a good advice. I appreciate that.
Chief,
Pete?
I talked to a woman out there who said that 3 bullets struck her kitchen window, shattered her kitchen window, and she wasn't sure if they were bullets from police or from this woman. Can you tell me, like, did any of the bullets from the police strike the homes there?
I can tell you that I don't have any reports. I believe the last count was 4 windows were busted in 3 apartments, but I don't have any accounts of rounds going through a window. And I'm not saying that didn't happen. I know they've canvassed that area twice, but right now I don't have any report of any rounds going through a window. I think there was a 911 call where someone said it might have happened because I heard a window break, but from what forensics has recovered, I don't have anything right now pointing that any rounds went into a residence.
There were 3 bullet holes in her screen, so it looked like they were.
3 bullet holes or 3 holes?
3 holes, which she said were bullet holes.
Yeah, I get it. And look, if I heard gunshots and all of a sudden my window was I can understand that. We can certainly follow up, but from the canvas we've done and did she tell you, I don't know if she told you that officers come in and find casings, but everything we have,
She said they didn't find casings in the house, but they
Yep.
still broke.
yeah, the windows were broken, I can tell you, but from what we understand, it was hit with a firearm on the butt of the firearm breaking windows. We don't have anything that points to rounds being fired through, but we can certainly double check. We just don't, I don't have any information on that yet. But like I said, I mean, going through, people may not even have been home, going back through that, I'm not gonna rule anything out. We're still very early.
So as far as you know, no bullets from the police struck any of the homes?
As far as we know, that's correct.
How many rounds were fired?
Yeah, I'm not gonna, just out of respect for Mr. Gwynn, his office, and the integrity of the case. And one of the reasons is we're gonna ask other people that we interview, how many rounds did you hear? And I don't wanna prejudice that by anything I would say at this point. So I'm not gonna get into the number of rounds that were fired by the officer. Just out of the case integrity, at 2.5 days in, I need to give them the ability to do a full investigation.
You train for instances like this, how difficult is it to de-escalate a situation when somebody is on fire?
So anytime you have someone who's agitated, and I'm just gonna speak for myself, right? And from things that we see across the country, anytime that you have someone that is agitated or emotions are elevated, and when, it's hard enough to calm someone down. But when you have a firearm, there's another element. Those officers aren't just responsible for themselves. They're now responsible for Mrs. Bonaparte, and they're also responsible for the individuals who live in that community. And you could hear the fear in individuals' voices who were calling. Some were whispering, but you could hear that. So how difficult is it? Some individuals, when you start having those conversations, whether it's a tactical operation and someone's inside and they're willing to talk, it can go very well. Sometimes it's, we're not going to talk to you at all. And then you kind of got the in-between, that something may set me off, or I'm not going to talk, or I'm in a depression state, or I want to hurt myself, or I want to hurt others. All those things are registering. It's a lot to process. Officers didn't come around the corner and open up fire. That didn't happen. They tried to de-escalate that situation. They tried to have a conversation. How do we know that? Because we know when they started talking, we know her 911 call, we know that time stamp of when those conversations are taking place. But you've got to have support of the other individual. And when you inject a firearm, movements and points and direction, and when you're in harm's way and danger, all of those things come into play. So I believe when you have someone with a firearm who's agitated, there's a lot of other things you're thinking about as just talking to someone who is upset and frustrated.
Does she have any known mental disorders?
So I don't want to get into, I can tell you, no, it's a fair question. It's something that we need to look at. I would certainly hope that we could talk to family members some more. I can tell you that there was some conversation on the 911 tapes, but I don't want to go much further than that. I think it paints a picture that we understand some things that we're going through, or that she was talking about or dealing with, but I don't want to go into classifying that until I've got some documentation in front of me, or until the detectives have been able to review some of that.
And could you spell her first and last name?
Sure, I'm sorry. Here we go. Her first name is Monet, Monae, and her last name is Bonaparte, Bonaparte, and she's a 38-year-old female.
She's a Portsmouth resident?
So, Pete, I was just talking to detectives before. Last known address was here in Newport News, but there's some family in Portsmouth, and I think there's some family in Hampton. So not exactly where she was actually residing or staying. What we know at this point is she was in Portsmouth and was trying to get a ride over to the side, over to the peninsula.
Just to follow up on her question, on the body cam footage, is it fair to say that the shield in the distance obscured the footage, so you can't really make out exactly.
Well, it certainly obscures the footage of the individual officers who are first in line, right? So we've got an individual with a firearm, and we don't have anywhere really to get behind, right, as officers get there to start to have some of those conversations. When you bring that bulletproof shield up, there's a plate of glass that you look through, right? And then it is going to cover some part of the body. And it also obstructs some of the view. So when one of the officer who peeled off to the left, there's a better angle there, or a better view. But we are talking about an open courtyard, so the better distance we have is safer for us and Miss Bonaparte at that point. But yeah, I think anytime you increase distance, the camera footage isn't going to be as sharp as it might be, as you and I are here, the further away it becomes a little bit more distorted. They're looking through some of that. There may be some technology that can help enhance that we'll look at or work through. But because it was an open courtyard, there was more distance. It wasn't like we were right up, individuals very close together. There was a good distance in that. If you can picture a courtyard, so I would say it played a part. Yeah.
What was the distance between the shooter and?
I haven't measured it. Now forensics might have by now. They may have gone out and walked it off and pasted it off, but I don't know the exact measurements. I did see the body worn camera footage that I saw. It kind of it's like Rose Apartments, and then that courtyard is just, it looks like a big rectangle, just kind of open, a large square rectangle. I would say more like a rectangle. But I don't have, I'd hate to tell you wrong, but I mean, that's something that they will do as they do their demographics and their drawings.
Did the shooter have a shield as well, or just?
Did the shooter?
The officer that peeled off and ended up firing, shooting her.
No, he had moved to the side to get it better. They kept the officers in line there behind the shield for safety, as to have some conversation. But I will tell you, I'm not going to get too much into the tactics that they used. I wanted to kind of let you paint a picture of what had happened, because some of that was hard to see. And there's I don't want to say it wrong, but some bushes or shrubberies there that she would move back and forth in between. So creating that other angle, that triangle effect, if you will, it created a better view. But it also put him in harm's way, if you will.
And she was in the middle of the courtyard?
No, she was kind of in between those the bushes and would step out. So that's one of the reasons that they had to create a different angle to get a better view. I'm gonna stop it there, just on, again, 2.5 days in, and making sure that the detectives have the ability to do what they need to do, that I don't hurt their case. And I will tell you that I talked to Mr. Gwynn that morning before I left, saw him again today. Look, I'll just end with this. I wish we didn't have to have this press conference. I wish that officers didn't have to respond to that scene. I wish citizens weren't in fear of what had happened. I wish that, there would have been a phone call on 911 right away when she got out of that vehicle. But that's not what we were presented with. And none of us can turn back the clock and rearrange things. The officers had to respond to the calls that they received and deal with what they were confronted with. We don't get to set those circumstances, and I wish it was different. I want us to remember that there's still a family grieving. And that's, like I said, we opened, regardless of the circumstance and situation, someone lost their life. So I ask also for respect for that family. I think her mom was very generous to have some conversations with me. I appreciated that, but I thought it was important that I at least talk to her. I was able to do that again today. So we'll go forward, but we will probably not do any other releases. Now we'll let the investigation take its course. It'll be submitted to the Commonwealth Attorney, and they'll make the decision about the incident. So we have to let the court process play out in the investigation. So we're gonna end it there. I appreciate you. I'm sorry about the time, but I wanted to have as much information that I could share with you today. So maybe we should have done this earlier, but I would not have had near the information. And again, just trying to be as transparent as we can without jeopardizing the case and the investigation, and also having respect for the officer, or for the family. And I meant to tell you and I think it was in the press release, Kelly, that we did, that the officer is on administrative leave, and will be that way until we get a decision. Okay? Thank you all for coming today and taking some time. I appreciate it.